So in this video, we're going to talk about the last big topic in 1942-1943 as part of our World War II series, the Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad is quite possibly the most famous battle during World War II. It's considered to be one of the turning points in stopping the Nazis and Hitler's army and the German advance across the Soviet Union. It's also one of the fiercest and bloodiest battles in the history of the world. So it's always an interesting battle to look at and study and think about all of the things that were involved in such a conflict. So to get started, you might remember that we talked back in 1941. Actually, it was May of 1941 that Germany launched what was called Operation Barbarossa, which of course was their invasion of the Soviet Union. If you recall that we talked about in class how the to Hitler, to Germany, they always assumed that fighting the French and the British was sort of like a sideshow, and that the real war, as they called it, would come with the Soviet Union. And so in May of 1941, surprise attack, German army using blitzkrieg rolls right on into the Soviet Union along a 2,000-mile front. And like we mentioned, that would be like if we drove from, Parma Heights down to Florida twice, or down there and back, I guess. We're talking about a huge piece of territory, and the Germans are able to push right into the Soviet Union, like we talked about, over 500 miles. The Soviets were caught completely off guard. Stalin couldn't believe they were being invaded. They returned to some of those tactics they had used against Napoleon, where they were using the scorched earth, trying to stop the German advance, but really, at first at least, in that early invasion, 1941, very little could stop it. We talked a little bit about how the Germans laid siege to Leningrad, how they were starving the people there to death. We talked about how the German armies rolled right outside of the capital of Moscow. They were just a few miles away from the city, and another group of German armies rolled into what were called the Caucuses. The Caucuses, this area down here near Stalingrad, that had lots of oil fields. Think about it. If you are going to do blitzkrieg with tanks and airplanes, you need oil. And Germany really has no oil, if any. And so Hitler looked at that area, what's known as the Caucasus in the Soviet Union, and said, boy, if I can grab that, I can grab some oil fields, I will be good to go. So the German army is highly successful beginning in 1941. And then by 1942, what's interesting is they haven't finished off Leningrad yet. They hadn't finished off Moscow yet. And Hitler hadn't quite captured the oil fields yet. But yet he sees another shiny little object known as Stalingrad. Stalingrad, of course, is the city named after his arch-rival Joseph Stalin. And so Hitler commands his panzers, turn and attack Stalingrad. He wants the city of Stalingrad. Here you see before the battle how nice and peaceful and happy all these people are. And Hitler's commander is looking at him like, hey man, we want to grab these oil fields. And Hitler says, I don't care, let's go get Stalingrad. And so the battle begins. August of 1942, German troops enter the city. We are talking about some of the fiercest warfare ever in the history of mankind. The fighting is street to street, house to house, room to room. The Germans have their Stuka bombers overhead, raining bombs down on the people of Stalingrad. The German stormtroopers are going through the rubble, house by house, fighting off any of the Soviet defenders. And the Germans nearly capture the city. They push the Red Army back towards the river there in Stalingrad, known as the Volga. In fact, today Stalingrad is called Volgograd. And they nearly capture the city. The Soviets do whatever they can to bring in supplies and reinforcements along the Volga River, but it's looking pretty bleak. It looks like Stalingrad is going to fall. Yet the Soviets put up such a defense that one of the German commanders mentions that the advance was measured in corpses, not in meters, meaning the fighting is so fierce that it's unbelievable that the Germans and the Soviets were just locked in this terrible, terrible fight. And like we said, by the summer of 1942 into the fall, it looks like Stalingrad is going to fall, that the Nazis are going to grab the city. But what the German planners don't realize is they have overextended their forces. and the Soviets have been building up their forces. They were using the scorched earth, they were using the time, just like they had done against Napoleon, to not only wait for the winter to strike, but also to build up their forces. And one thing the Soviet Union had a lot of are people. They were able to bring in over 1 million troops, along with tanks and airplanes. And now the German army found itself inside of the rubble of Stalingrad, being surrounded by Soviet troops. 1 million of them. The huge Soviet counterattack cuts off this German army under the command of a Field Marshal Paulus. And Paulus begs Hitler. He says, look, we got a last chance here. We can get out of Stalingrad. We can escape back towards the Caucasus. We're being surrounded. If we wait, we're going to be surrounded. We're going to be destroyed. And Hitler tells him, too bad. Stand and fight. Don't give up Stalingrad. We'll send another German army to help you. And so the German army stays and is trapped now in the city. So the Soviets completely turned the tables on him. It looked like they were going to grab the city, and now all of a sudden 1 million Soviet troops arrive and surround the entire German army. The fighting continues to go on, house to house. Like I said, room to room, as brutal as can be. There is a German panzer unit that is sent to try to relieve Stalingrad through the snow. But the Soviets have so many troops and so many tanks by this point, towards the beginning of 1943, that they push the relief forces back as well. And Paulus is stuck inside of Stalingrad with nowhere to go and no help coming. So even though Hitler had told them to stand and fight, after a while, Paulus decides, all right, this is futile, and he surrenders. And literally, thousands of German troops surrender at Stalingrad. Most of them will never return home, as the Soviets are every bit as brutal as the Nazis were. And this is considered to be the turning point of the European War. Because again, just like when the Japanese were stopped at Midway from expanding, here Hitler is stopped at Stalingrad for the first time. The Blitzkrieg, his war machine, is stopped. And from there, he's going to be dealing now with the Soviet steamroller. And when I say steamroller, I mean it because the Soviets now have had time to marshal their troops, get supplies. They've come up with a plan. One of the most famous Soviet commanders in World War II is General Zhukov. Zhukov was a military genius, and he comes up with plans for not only are we going to defeat the Germans, we're going to push them all the way back to Germany. And you see that Soviet steamroller. Even though the Germans had pushed out 500 miles to Stalingrad, to Moscow, to Leningrad, once that army surrenders at Stalingrad, Zhukov uses the next couple of years to literally push the Nazi army back all the way to Berlin, all the way to Hitler's bunker. The Soviets, by 1943, have developed the T-34 tank, which was every bit as good as the German panzers. And just like North Africa, if you get out here in this area of the world, places like Ukraine, Belarus, we're talking about these big, flat, grassy areas, not a lot of mountains, not a lot of trees, perfect for tank warfare. Hitler still refuses to surrender. He decides he is going to upgrade his panzers now, launches a whole new group of panzers, Tiger tanks, all sorts of new innovations, and he decides he's going to launch another offensive into the Soviet Union in July of 1943. This is known as the Battle of Kursk. It is the largest tank battle in the history of the world. The T-34s, the Panzers, slugging it out. And you see some of the pictures here, what it looked like across this huge, flat, grassy plains. With the Battle of Kursk, the Soviets had broken some of the coding that the Germans were using, and they basically tricked the Germans. They draw them in, they surround them, they start to refer to it as Little Stalingrad, and again, they destroy the German advance. So by the fall of 1943, the Germans will no longer be able to push into the Soviet Union, and the Soviet steamroller is going to continue to push them back into Germany as we enter the end of 1943, 1944, and then finally the surrender in 1945. So the Battle of Stalingrad becomes the turning point in the European War. And of course now the Germans are fighting on just against the Soviets on the one front, But you'll see in 1944 as well, the two-front war will resume as the Allies will be landing in Normandy. And that's probably where we'll pick up at some point. I hope that you enjoyed our video and it helped you. Another very good video to help you with your writing prompt. Thanks, everybody.